All right, well, welcome everyone to our 1881 series, What's on Tap? The world of Hop-portunities. Tonight, we're going to talk about all things hops, from flavor profiles to chemical reactions, hop combinations, and IBUs, which I've learned from discussion with our panelists tonight is somewhat controversial. So we'll find out whether they agree or disagree with that measurement, if you've ever seen that, to anything you can think about in between in the world of hops. To those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. It's absolutely a treat you're in for tonight. And during the What's on Tap events, we basically blend all of our alumni expertise and our UConn faculty expertise into a fun night of beer and some lifelong learning. So we're thrilled to have you. For those of you returning for another gander here at our What's on Tap series, we're thrilled to welcome you back. Hopefully you're sitting there with one of your favorite beers next to you. And if you haven't grabbed that yet, make sure you go over there, your fridge, grab that, crack that open, and join us tonight. My name is Josh Brewer. I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Relations here at UConn for Regional Engagement, and I am thrilled to once again be your host once again here for the 1881 series, What's on Tap. I am the resident beer nerd in our office and a hop head, so this is fun for me, and it's exciting to always hear about the different things that are happening out there. Tonight, we are excited to be here with this group. As I can tell you, I'm always in awe of getting together with these three. Their knowledge, they're fun, they're exciting to be around, and you'll have a blast listening to them, and you'll hear the natural camaraderie that just happens from folks in the beer industry. So buckle up, pour yourself your favorite hopped up beer, and enjoy as we rekindle our hoppy relationships with some of our fantastic UConn experts working in the beer world. Before we get started, though, a couple quick things here to help you maximize your participation. First, we do have closed captioning available. And should you wish to utilize this service, please visit your Zoom toolbar and select the CC option to activate your subtitles. I'm joined by my colleague, Sam Morris Avery, tonight, who's actually going to be dropping that into the chat now as well. So if you do have any technical challenges as well, and actually, you know what? I just got a message here. Let me make sure that class closed captioning is good to go. It is up and running there. Hey, there you go. So if you have any questions, you can activate that CC piece now. And if you have any questions tonight, we do expect a lot of those to come through. So to help streamline those Q&As that come through, please utilize that Q&A toolbar or section on your toolbar, not the chat function. We're going to use that for a different purpose tonight. So if you have questions, throw that into that Q&A section, and then we'll go through and get through as many of those as we can tonight in our 90 minutes together. For those of you that have joined us in the past, you know these virtual events in 1881 can be really fun and exciting and a great way to socialize with fellow alums. So familiarize yourself with that chat function on your toolbar. It's a great place to connect with other Huskies from around the globe, share what you're drinking. If you have an untapped profile and you want to make some new friends, it's a great opportunity to drop that in there. But to kick us off, we'd love to always check in and see where you all are logging in from tonight. So if you can go ahead, drop in where you're dialing in from tonight. We'd love to see that, and we'll check on that in just a minute as that filters through. But before we get our discussion started, I want to make sure that you all know we have no slouches here when it comes to our speaking on these panels. All of them are veterans of one of our 1881 panels before, and absolute rock stars when it comes to beer. Looks like we are in Rochester. That's the only one I'm seeing so far, but go ahead and drop in where you guys are dialing in from. But I'll get us started here by bringing in our panelists. I'm thrilled to be welcoming in our resident university expert, Dr. Jen Pascal. She is an associate professor in residence for UConn's Department of Chemical Engineering, also the assistant department head, and she teaches our Intro to Brewing course that I'm sure many of you didn't even realize UConn has, and she is really the rock star behind getting things up and running for a brewing program here at UConn. So Jen, it's always a pleasure to have you here. I see you're rocking your 1881 shirt just like me, so obviously repping the brand, so we appreciate that, and I'm thrilled to have you. I'll throw it your way, and I'll jump off the screen here.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you all for joining here. I'm really honored to be here with Max and Sydney. They're both UConn alums, and they know a lot more about beer and hops than I do. So I'm moderating. Like Josh said, I'm a chemical engineer by training. I really love the intersection of brewing and beer with science and engineering. So I'm continuing to learn, and I hope to learn a lot more tonight. But I'll let Sydney and Max go ahead and introduce themselves real quick so you know a little bit about their background. So Sydney, if you want to go first.
Sure. My name's Sydney Porter. I graduated UConn in 2015. I started beer career a week after I graduated at a brewery in Connecticut called Outer Light Brewing Company. From there, I moved to Texas, and I've worked at a few breweries down here in Houston until my family and I opened Southern Yankee Beer Company, where I am currently the head brewer and co-owner of, where we just expanded last year to open our restaurant in Montrose, which is downtown Houston, called Southern Yankee Craft House, which we serve our beer at both locations. And I like talking about beer.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be back here again on the 1881 series. I also graduated from UConn in 2015. I got a biology degree, but bartended my way through college and decided I was more passionate about beer than I was about working in a lab for the rest of my life. So I started with 6 Point Brewery in a sales role about 6.5 years ago. And after I got my advanced Cicerone, they created a role for me doing education. So now I'm the senior manager of education and training for Artisanal Brewing Ventures, and that's Victory, 6 Point, and Southern Tier breweries. And yeah, I love talking about beer too, which is basically my day-to-day job is training our sales team, our marketing team, our brewers, and then working with our distributor partners and outside retailers. And when I'm lucky enough, getting to interact directly with our customers and our consumers to talk about beer. So I'm looking forward to it and always excited to talk about hops.
All right, awesome. So hops, we can start with maybe the farming and the harvesting of hops, because hops can only be grown in kind of a pretty narrow region in the world, and they have very specific conditions under which they grow. And, I've read different things. It could take several years for them to be ready, or it can be a little quicker depending on the conditions. So if maybe both of you want to speak to how the farming and harvesting goes, and then how they get from the farm to a brewery.
I actually learned, so we talked about this before, and so I'm not a farmer, but in my whole education, I was always told it took 2 to 3 years for it to grow. And Max actually said that, the first year, if they do it in the right conditions, they can get that hop going, which is really nice. But they grow very fast, and they grow every year. So they're grown from rhizomes, it's basically like ginger, that's a rhizome, turmeric, that's a rhizome. And then they are cut down every year, but they grow up to 20 feet in 3 months?
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, they grow like weeds, and historically they were treated like a weed until 1,200 years ago when they really started to become prominent in beer. But yeah, it's pretty commonly stated that it takes 2 to 3 years to get a crop of hops when you freshly plant new acreage. I've been out to Yakima a couple times now to deal with our farmers and to do selection of the hops that we're going to buy, and it's the best possible way to learn about hops. Every time you talk to a farmer, you're learning something new about what they're thinking about, what they're focusing on. And one of the things that I learned the first time I was out there was that, especially in Yakima and in the Pacific Northwest in general, they have a lot of irrigation. So it doesn't rain in Yakima during the summertime, right? It just doesn't happen. They might get rain once or twice over the course of the summer, definitely not enough for reliable farming. So everything is heavily irrigated. And once you're irrigating hops and using drip irrigation on each individual plant, then you can get a really successful yield even in the first year. So not a full crop. They won't do, if it's a new varietal, something that's just sort of coming into commercial viability, they won't go so far as to tell you what the yield is going to be per acre on that. They call it a baby crop the first year. Yeah. And that'll typically be 75 to 80% yield from farmers that I've talked to. But you're right, absolutely. And traditionally, growing in Germany, growing in the Czech Republic, growing in most of the world where it's a less irrigated or not at all irrigated crop, you're not going to see it being worth it to harvest those first year hops. So they just let them grow and then chop it all down, like you said, Sydney, and then let them come back that second year. Maybe they would get a small crop the second year, but then 3 years to a full mature harvest.
Yes. So Yakima Valley, you mentioned. So is that the place in the United States that grows the most hops? And then what other parts of the world are most of our hops grown in, or traditionally anyhow?
I just threw a graphic that I love into the chat so that everyone can see the visual representation of it. One of the things that's really important for hops, the plant, is the photo period, right? They have to get exactly the right amount of sunlight every day for them to flower. You could grow hops in Miami, but you're never going to get the cones, and the cones is what brewers are looking for.
Yeah.
And it's also what contains the seed, so that you wouldn't be able to naturally watch hops move from North America to South America. But those bands of latitudes that are viable for hop growing perfectly align with the traditional brewing centers around the world, right? So the Pacific Northwest is the best agricultural farmland we have for hops, especially once you take into account the irrigation in the United States. But Germany around Munich and Bavaria and those regions that have long traditions of beer drinking also have really good hop growing. England has really good hop growing. Belgium has really good hop growing. The Czech Republic has really good hop growing. So it's not a coincidence that these regions that we think of as beer regions, with it, especially with that Eurocentric lens, also have great hop crops. And those are the spots that we like to buy hops from.
Yep. I agree. I mean, there's different, and those are like the ideal ones, but that's not to say that there aren't places that don't grow small amounts. I mean, when I was still brewing in Connecticut, there was one farm that I believe is still growing hops in Connecticut, and it's a more challenging thing, and you're not going to get nearly as much. So it's not like heavily commercially viable, but it is like, it still can be grown, right? But you're not going to be able to, harvest a crop and sell it if you only get 10 pounds of cones.
Sure. And that's a really good point. I mean, there are commercial hop farms in New York State, in Michigan. I don't know of anyone in Connecticut who's growing enough so that they're selling widely, but there are breweries in Connecticut that grow their own hops. New York State, traditionally, if you look back to the 1800s, New York State was a really big historical hop growing region. But
so wasn't that the hub before they really went into the West, was New York?
Yeah. But before the westward expansion of the American, agriculture, New York State was the big one. And there are some really tasty hops coming out of New York State and some really tasty hops coming out of Michigan. It's not to say that only Yakima can grow good hops, but in terms of volume, we're definitely seeing the big lion's share of the tonnage, because there's thousands of acres of hops in Yakima Valley and Idaho and Oregon.
All right. Yeah. So you answered one of the questions that was in the Q&A, actually, which is about growing hops in New England. So yeah, it can be done, just maybe not a high yield.
I mean, the plant will grow.
Yeah.
And you might get a couple cones, but it'll smell good.
Yeah, I definitely have friends that grow their own hops, but it's for like home brewing. So how do you, get going from the farm to the brewery? How does that work? Do you guys have contracts with different hop growers, or are there other steps in between? How does that whole process work?
For larger breweries, for like, I'd imagine with 6 Pint, they require a contract because you're brewing mass amounts of things that need to maintain consistency. For my size, we have a 3.5 barrel brew house, so we're very small. We probably brew in a year what they drop on the floor in a week. We don't contract right now, partially because we only have 4 year rounds, and then all the rest we're constantly changing. And that both gives me the freedom to be creative, as well as kind of flow with what ingredients I can find that are quality and are good. And that's called a spot hop market, where I can buy directly from the farms, from third parties, or even from breweries that over-contracted hops, and they will sell to other breweries at a discount.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like Sydney said, scale has everything to do with this answer. So if you're brewing on a 3-barrel system, or even if you're brewing on a 10-barrel system, it might not make sense for you to have big hop contracts.
Yeah.
The caveat to that, I would say, is like, if you have a flagship beer that really relies on one hop, maybe, and especially if you have forecastable volumes, it might be sensible to at least contract that one hop, so you don't find yourself where you're all of a sudden paying $35 a pound for the hop that you need for your flagship beer, because that can happen on the spot market sometimes.
For sure. It hasn't happened yet. but
Yeah, but you know, if you need Nelson Sauvin at the wrong time of year, or there's a shortage
no,
of Nelson Sauvin, then
you ain't getting that.
you ain't getting it, right. But contracts have some benefits for sure, right? Farmers love contracts because they know what acreage they should plant, and they know they're going to have a buyer for those hops as soon as they get picked. From a brewery point of view, you're locking in your price, so you know what your cost of goods is going to be for your finished beer for the entire year, or for 5 years if you have all of your raw materials contracted out.
Mm-hmm.
It also gives you the stability of not having to worry about finding those hops on the spot market later. And depending on the quantities that you're getting, you can get some increased customer service from your hop suppliers, right? So if we contract straight with a farmer or with one of the bigger companies who distributes, someone like Hopstein or Haas or YCH, they're going to let us come out to Yakima and smell 10 different lots of Citra and pick which one we want. And that's a benefit that you don't get if you're just buying 50 pounds at a time on the spot market. You sort of get what you get, and they'll tell you the alpha acids, and you can probably see some sort of oil levels, but you don't actually get to smell it before you buy it. Or pick from 10 different ones. Right, Sydney? I assume that's...
No, it's totally true. And that's why it is, I guess, more inherently risky. But when you're in a small space, right, you can't really contract for that much because you don't know if you're going to need this or that. But that's when that comes into it, right? So you're locking down in a large contract a lot or a whole batch. You have a little bit more of that consistency. And that's one thing that, like, I've kind of described large breweries as being able to kind of be pretty stable, where smaller breweries, you kind of have to go with the flow, see what's happening. You have to make sure that you're doing sensory from beginning to end to make sure your product is going to be within your brand guidelines. And that's when you get into a bigger brewery and be able to have more accuracy in those lots and your ingredients, your brand guideline can kind of get narrower, and you're able to really lock in a single flavor and a single beer. Where when you're super small, like 3.5, we have a little bit wider brand guidelines where I make sure it's within this, and then it has a little bit more wiggle room in there, just because, you know, the availability of certain ingredients and making sure you know, this alpha acid's here, you do different math. Like, we'll get into the whole math situation, but there's a little bit more like just going with the flow.
Totally. And I sort of think of it as akin to wine, right? Like the bigger you get, if you're a Sierra Nevada of the world, and I love Sierra Nevada, this is not meant with any sort of malice towards their beers. They do phenomenal work. But if you're a customer and you go out and buy a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, you expect it to taste like the last 6-pack of Sierra Nevada Pale Ale that you bought, right?
Absolutely.
Just like a really big, you know, if you go out and buy Barefoot wine, you expect it to taste like Barefoot wine always tastes. But if you go out and buy a brewery that you know is a 3-barrel brew house, and you're buying an IPA that maybe is a new one, or maybe it's a beer that they've brewed before, but you're definitely going to give it a little bit more leeway. The same that you would with a winery who has vintage to vintage variations, and the 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon is going to taste different than the 2016 Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah. And that is, so before we move to the next one, that's like one of those things that people, you have to train new people to craft beer, and especially if they're going into a small space, because consistency is probably one of the largest challenges to do in beer specifically. And then as you get smaller, it's harder and harder, just because of all of these things we're talking about. And so wine has the leeway to just call it a different vintage, where beer, you have to make sure you hit your values and make sure your sensory is in that brand guideline. Otherwise people will be like, well, this isn't right. And you have to kind of rename it.
Right. It falls into another style or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned sensory analysis. So, yeah, how do you go about a sensory analysis? So I had the privilege of doing one with hops with the Connecticut Pink Boots Society,
nice,
which was really cool. So yeah, how do you all evaluate the hops you're getting? And I don't know in what form you're getting them, if you're getting them on pellets or whole cones or it varies.
So at my scale, which I would probably relate to people that are, home brewers, if you want to do some of those sensory things, the first kind of things for me is doing that visual, making sure it's that nice, really good green, nice and bright colors. Because generally, if you're getting hops, they're pelletized. So they've been processed and some of that vegetal matter has been taken out and you're getting kind of concentrated lupulin, which is what holds all the hop goodness. And then kind of smushing it in your hand, that releases some of those flavors, that releases a lot of the aroma. And then doing a hop tea. So we'll do a hop tea to get some of that, I know we haven't talked about it, but the isomerization to kind of taste what the flavors are in that boil. And that's one way. And then another way is to do pilot batches. I don't usually do pilot batches. I just kind of do, my sensory and then kind of like, all right, we're going to wing it, see what happens. And then probably big style, like on that scale, especially since you're doing your master Cicerone. I mean, when you get into sensory, you have to be in like a little box and you have to have silence and you have to make sure you didn't eat something and all of that.
Yeah, it's very
that's
intense.
all true.
Silent.
Absolute silence at all times. Hop sensory is one of those things that I think there's a real skill to it, and I have the utmost respect. This is another one of those things where you talk to the farmers, and hops don't smell the same when they're in the field as they do after they've been kilned, which is sort of the first step of hop processing before it even gets pelletized. They dry them out. And then, so kilned hops have a different aromatic compounds than pelletized hops would have. And even pelletized hops, it's really hard to translate what's in your hands to what's going to end up in the finished beer, or even at the beer at different stages of the brewing process, right? So there are some farmers who, if you ever meet one of those people and you recognize the skill in them, then you latch onto them and you just keep them as a partner, right? Because they'll say to you, oh, this varietal in the field at this time of year, the best batches always have a carrot green aroma to them. And then a carrot green aroma is never anything that you would expect to find in the finished beer, but there's a chemical that they're smelling in the fields that translates to something that's really nice in the finished beer. So when you talk about hop sensory, you have to be really specific about which stage of the process you're talking about, right? I like to do hop sensory on kilned hops that haven't been pelletized yet, where you have whole cone hops. That might be what you were doing, Jen, with the Pink Boot Society, or was it pellets?
The pellets, like Sydney was talking about, crush them up, make a hop tea and stuff, yeah.
Sure. So when you do a hop selection, right, if you're working with the farmers or the suppliers and they're letting you pick between different batches that you to see which one is best for your IPA or best for your program, they'll almost always do it in the whole cone stage. So then, like Cindy said, you can see the color of the hops, you can rip them in half and see what the structure of the cones looks like and see what the lupulin looks like, rub them together and get them nice and warm in your hands so that you're expressing more of those oils and aromatics. But again, if you smell diesel in a Rawaka hop, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get diesel in the finished beer. You might, that's just an example. Like I sometimes do get diesel and petrol notes in Southern Hemisphere, New Zealand, Australia hops in particular, but it's not always a one-to-one translation. So you do have to sort of figure that out, and taking really good notes can help on that. Like writing down what you smell and what you taste at a certain stage, and then that same lot later on, you can start to see, in this batch, we got tons of diesel in the raw hop, and then it translated to a really nice gooseberry in the finished beer. And then for next time.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much of this that, there's some science, obviously a lot of science, but there's also, I feel like, a lot of intuition and, kind of an art to this as well. And a lot of it can be subjective too, depending on people's palates and things, which is super interesting as well, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. One other question I had was about new varieties of hops. So say, you want to make like a new type of hop, from start to finish, like how long would that take if you wanted to brew beer on the market with a new type of hop?
I mean,
a long time, right?
A long time, because right, you're you're breeding them. Like you have to mix and breed like the hops that you have now and try and see what comes of it. And that generally means you need to give the plant time to grow and like see where it is at peak. And then sometimes those peak are like not great and it tastes like cat piss and it's not good. Right. And then there's sometimes where it's like, holy crap, this is like a mango. I mean, it's a long time. So and it's a lot of them are universities that are and like large hop farms and large hop conglomerates are like really foraging through in these not foraging into these education and melding of these hops because it takes so long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a really long timeline. Sydney sort of alluded to this. Like the USDA has a really robust hop breeding program.
Nice.
Some of the bigger companies, Haas, who's based in Germany, but they have a really nice hop breeding program in the Pacific Northwest and in Germany. Yakima Chief has a hop breeding program internally. Hopsteiner has an internal hop breeding program. I mean, we could go down the rabbit hole of talking about whether trademarked hop varietals are good for beer or not good for beer. That's one of the reasons I like talking about the USDA program, because those are all open source hops that you could buy and plant in your backyard. You can't do that with these privatized hops. They don't sell rhizomes. Mm-hmm. So the timeline that they always used to talk about was like 15 years, which from first cross, which means, you're planting a hill of one new hop. And then the farmer, before you even get to talking about sensory, the farmers want to make sure it grows. They want to make sure the plant looks good. They want to make sure it looks like a good phenotype of what it's supposed to look like. And then maybe they'll expand it out to a whole row on a hop farm, and they'll see what it looks like in terms of disease resistance, in terms of pest resistance. And then, if it's lucky, maybe it'll get to a half an acre. And, 5 years later, you're talking about an acre of land. And that's when you get to the point where you can actually cut them down, harvest them, kiln them, give them to brewers and see what brewers think about them, right? Like you're not just talking about one hop tea. You can actually brew 3 barrels of beer then and see if you like it. So 15 years has always sort of been the benchmark for commercially going from just going into the ground for the first time to being sellable at a real scale. Some of those private hop farmers have done some work in the last couple of years to shave 2 to 4 years off that timeline, based on learning the genetics of what makes a plant resistant to downy mildew and powdery mildew, some of the diseases that would take it out. So they can look in the lab and say, this is going to have good disease resistance. And that takes a couple of years off of that. But it's still, even by shaving 4 years off, you're still talking 10 years into the future. So from the farmer's point of view, they have to be thinking about what is a brewer going to want in 2032 for the hops that they're planting for the first time this year. Right? What new aromas can you be going for? And what one of the things they're talking a lot about now is climate change and climate resistance and water needs. Yeah. So there's a lot that goes into that agronomic side.
Oh yeah, no, that's a very complex problem for sure.
So it's not just what brewers want, right? You said, I mean, it has to grow, right? It has to be able to be produced in a efficient manner. At the same time, I mean, we recently had not new hop, but like we had a company try and grow hops down here in Houston in a greenhouse, and I was like, go for it. I mean, I bought some and I was like, all right, cool. But after a couple of years, like a lot of it's a challenging crop to do. And that's why you see a lot of people that are generational, right? It's family to family. It's community to community, because it's an art, just like making beer is an art. Doing farming like that and doing stuff where you're doing sensory analysis and creating new varietals for beer. I mean, that's a whole nother ball game.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it. I didn't realize, that it was, such a complicated, challenging thing. But yeah, I have heard of universities doing it, like Oregon State, right? I think, yeah. It would be great if UConn, since we have such a great school of agriculture. Yeah.
Oregon State has, I believe his name is Tom Schellerhorn. It might be Schemmerhorn, but he's like one of the foremost hop experts in the world, and he sort of runs that USDA hop breeding program and their hop labs out at Oregon State, and they're a really big contributor to a lot of the best science that comes out around this stuff.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, I think, hopefully UConn can eventually do something like that. It'd be really cool. So yeah, next, what types of hops are your all's favorites, and why? And how do you use them how do you pick different hops for different recipes when you're designing a new brew?
What's my favorite? I don't know. I'm gonna let Max talk first because I gotta think about it for a minute.
I was gonna let you talk first because I think you obviously have much more of a hand in the recipe design phase and brewing beer at this point than I do. I think my personal favorite hops, if I had to pick an old school American hop, it would probably be Centennial. I love Centennial hops. For the new school hops, especially on the aroma side, I really like Strata. I think Strata works well on its own, but also as a supporting hop. That one's known for having strawberry and passion fruit. And Indie Hops is the company out of Oregon that sells Strata hops predominantly. We get our hops from from Indie Hops, and they call it a wafting marijuana note, which is code. I mean, not even coded at this point. We haven't talked about this at all, but for all you guys at home, hops and marijuana are really close botanical cousins.
They're related.
So there's a lot of overlap in the aromatics and the terpenes that you'll get there. No CBD, no THC.
You're not going to get high off a beer.
Right. You're not going
Off of hops.
If a bartender ever hands you an IPA that smells like weed, that's where it's coming from. It's coming from the hops. And so now societally, we're at a point where marijuana is illegal in more states than ever before. And hop companies can just come out and say that this hop smells like wafting marijuana, and that's okay in 2022. But I think Strata can be a great hop. Yeah, I'll stick with those two for now.
I'm like, okay, so if you gave two, I was like, okay, cool, I've got four.
Perfect.
So like also, so like in my description of how I brew and the way I design recipes, I'm more of what is known, I guess, as a traditionalist. So I do new things. Like I've tried my hand at doing my version of pastry stouts and the big hazies and stuff like that. But like my like fun is like a great Vienna lager. Or like a pill, like I just did a second brew of my Pilsner, Paramount Pils, and I'm just like, because to me a Pilsner is like the pinnacle of a brewer's ability.
Yes.
It shows how you're able to control the process because it's such a simple and crisp beer that if you do anything wrong, it shows up in the end product. So like my two favorite, I guess, traditional style hops would be Saaz and Tettnang. They're noble hops. So those are like the, OG German noble hops that what you put in a lot of like those traditional styles to give what is colloquially known as like noble hop spice, which is kind of like, that's their characteristic. I'd say American, like new school would probably, or not new school, like old school American hop, I guess, would probably be like Chinook. I love Chinook.
Yeah.
Really nice grapefruit notes and like some really nice pithiness sometimes. It's just crisp, beautiful. It's good in so many different styles, and how you use it, it changes the flavors of it and like when you're putting it in the process. And then probably one of the, I guess it's like a newer, maybe not newer, but it's called Velma. And I love Velma. It gives like berry and like some melon kind of flavors. It's so tasty. And a lot of breweries I've taught, or a lot of brewers have talked to, don't use it as much because it is a lower alpha acid new school style hop, so you have to use more of it to get the flavors that like that big punch you're looking for. But it's just it's more subtle and like smooth and just gives these amazing berry like flavors to IPAs that I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So how are hops kind of classified? I mean, there's like kind of like there's like the high alpha, the aroma hops and things like that, but I don't know if there's like newer terminology with respect to how they're sort of characterized, or if it's more, more by intuition. And
I guess, I mean, it depends on like what you're looking for, because you can characterize hops into a lot of different like slots. The old school way of looking at as a bittering hop and a flavor hop or aroma hop is kind of outdated. I mean, there are some, like Magnum hops is a very clean bittering hop that I use all the time. It's my favorite bittering hop. That's like my standard starting point with most like hoppy beers. You don't really want to put that in the late editions. I mean, I've never done it, but like, I don't foresee that being a good thing. It really just depends on like, if you're looking at like new breeds or old school styles. I mean, I don't know. I feel like there's like dozens of different ways of categorizing it. And I'd imagine there's probably new ones, especially doing it more educational, because beer has become more educational in the last like 20 years. There's probably new ways of categorizing them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everything Sydney said is absolutely true. I think when I talk to brewers and talk to hop growers and farmers about hops, like she said, the bittering or aroma or flavor sort of classifications that you'll see in books from even 10 years ago, but definitely books that were in 15, 20 years ago, those terms are sort of falling out of favor. And people are talking more specifically about alpha levels and about oil levels, right? Because those are sort of the two things that brewers are looking for. And alpha, we've used this term a couple times now, so I might as well define it for people at home.
I was going to ask that next.
I didn't even think about that.
Alpha levels, that's referring to your alpha acids, and that's one of the primary sort of ingredients in a hop cone that brewers look at. And your alpha acid is what is going to be the chief component that ends up creating bitterness in a beer. So the higher your alpha acid levels are, the more likely that hop is to become a candidate to use for bittering, like Magnum that Sydney was talking about, right? The Magnum's going to have high alpha levels, so it doesn't take a ton of it if you throw it in early in the boil and you isomerize those alpha acids and they become IBUs or bitterness. Oils is sort of the other part, and when farmers or growers or sellers talk about oils, they're talking about these essential oils, the terpenes. There are sort of 8 major ones that get broken down in what we would call a certificate of analysis. So you can talk about caryophyllene and linalool and
like try to go through them in my head.
Yeah, citronellol and 5 other ones. And then there's always this little slot at the bottom that says other oils, right? And so some of the newer hops, something like Sabro, shows up huge on that other oils percentage when you look at the total oil weight. But going back to the basics, the oil content, the higher the oils is, the more explosive it's going to be if you put it in later in the process, end of your boil or whirlpool or dry hop with it. You're going to get a more expressive aromatic component from that hop if the oil level is higher. So you don't need high alphas to get high expression, and you don't need high oils to get high bitterness, but there are also hops that have both. So that's why farmers will say, oh, we have this new varietal that has high alphas, low oils. That's code for it's going to be a good bittering hop.
Yeah.
But they're using a new terminology to sort of say that, so that if they say it has high alphas and high oils, then you can sort of plug and play wherever you might like to with it.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of things related to that. One, the question in the chat actually probably related to the oils in the hops. What's the difference between citrus versus piney hops? And then you also mentioned isomerization. So isomerization is really important when you're adding hops, when you're boiling your wort, right? Because that reaction happens under the influence of heat. And so if you can explain that a little bit too, that would be great.
It's a chemical change, right? So you have alpha acids and then you add heat and you're changing the chemical I mean, you're a chemical engineer. I took chem and I was an engineer for like a year, but like, but it basically changes the structure of the actual alpha acid
exactly
molecule.
It changes the branching essentially, and
exactly. Yeah. And so that it changes the flavor. It changes the perception. It changes the output, I guess, of the compound. That's what isomerization is. Yeah.
Yeah, so the alpha acids aren't soluble in the water, in water, right? Unless they're, there's heat added, and then converts them to iso alpha acids that are soluble, if I'm not mistaken.
I didn't know that. That's cool. Learning something new every day.
No, I'm learning a lot too.
Yeah, my understanding is that it both, the solubility is important, but also the bitterness perception increases. So if you had non-isomerized alpha acids in a sensory lineup, they wouldn't strike you as particularly bitter.
Yeah.
It's the isomerization that, like you said, Jen, it increases the solubility, but also increases that bitterness perceived.
Yeah. So, sorry.
What was the other part of the question?
Yeah, difference between citrus versus piney hops.
The oil.
Yeah, that's where it's going to come down to the individual levels of oil, whether
linalool and then pinene, right? And then geraniol is kind of floral, where you're getting what's the other one? Myrcene. Myrcene's that's like that earthy, piney flavor, right? Okay, I was like just trying to go there in my head. So like the different concentration of all those different oils will kind of change what flavors you're getting from it. And then on top of that, I think also the use of when you're adding things and like how if you're isomerizing the hop or the oil, the alpha acids, that will kind of change how you're perceiving some of those oils, and whether or not it's more kind of earthy or more citrusy. And it depends on your use, on the concentration. I mean, there's lots of little factors to it.
For sure. And this sort of answers, my opinion on this sort of answers two of the questions that are in the Q&A right now. The one about citrus versus piney, and the next one that I see about, the discussion of hops. How is this going to help you choose a particular beer at the local pub or brewery? That's a great question. And the honest answer to that is it depends.
Try it.
With trial and error, you might find that there are certain hops that you absolutely don't like. There are two hops that I know of that I just don't like. Sabro is one of them, right? Sabro is sort of one of those new cool hops on the market, and it's an expensive hop on spot. It gets described as coconut and vanilla and sometimes oaky or woody. And to me, it just reads as sunscreen. So I can tell almost instantly with a beer if it's using Sabro, if it's anything but the faintest supporting note. And I just don't like it. It reads as sunscreen to me. So I know if I see sunscreen on the board at the brewery, if I see Sabro on the board at the brewery, I'm not going to order that beer because it's going to taste like sunscreen. Sriracha Ace is another one for me. It has a dill note that is.
I was like, that's.
It has dill and lemongrass, and I kind of like those things. Yeah. But whatever chemical is in Sabro is probably also in Sriracha Ace, because that also has a little sunscreen note to me. That makes me not like it. Jen, Sabro is sunscreen. But not for everyone. Lots of people love Sabro and love that coconut note. And I love coconuts and toasted coconuts and coconut flavor. I don't know what it is about Sabro. I've actually been trying to figure that out with some hop farmers, and they don't even really have the answer for me yet. But that is sort of to say that other than hops that you dislike, there's a lot of overlap in hops. Cascade hops can taste like Centennial hops. Centennial hops can taste like a really good batch of Centennial might have some overlap with a lower quality batch of Citra hop. So until you taste the beer and know the quality of the hops that brewery is using, I would just ask for a sample of an IPA and see if you like it that way, because the sampling the beer is going to be more valuable than anything we can say here about individual hop variety differences.
For sure. That's that. I mean, and especially like you can have a description, and then you personally might taste something completely different. and if you really want to get into it, like recording what hops you're drinking and like what your flavors, what you're talking about, and like how you like it. I mean, mosaic hops make me sneeze. So I know the second I have a beer that's mosaic, I'm like, okay, that's mosaic, because it makes me sneeze. I don't know why, but it does. And so you have different, everybody's perceived flavors will be slightly different. And even you can try a beer one day and it might change the next day because of what you're eating, what the weather's like. I mean, there's different outside factors that can change. I mean, if you're in a dirty glass, that can change what you're tasting as well.
Yeah, so this also goes hand in hand with when you like what flavors you get at the end, and when your beer is ready or done, when you add the hops, if you add them in the wort boil, or do you do dry hopping, add them on the cold side. Dave asked a question in the chat about fresh hopping and what that is, and how do those, when those additions take place, impact the flavor of the beer.
A fresh hop is when you basically pick a hop off a vine and use it the same day. Here in Houston, we do not get fresh hops. I mean, you can, but you have to get them like an hour shipped, and it's like thousands of dollars. So it's just not a reality to have fresh hops. You can see in the South, you get wet hops, which wet hops are freshly picked, but not day of. Right. And then that is that in a beer. And those, a lot of times you can get a lot of like really big immediate flavors, and it's a different way of brewing completely. No, I mean, not completely, but you're using a non-dried full whole cone. So you have to do different things in your brew house to get better extraction. And then at the same time, on the hot side, you'll lose a little bit more because of some absorption from the vegetal matter. So it changes the way you're doing things in the brew house and how you're treating the hop based on the actual hop you're getting, instead of using pellets.
I see. So yeah, how would you still get bitterness? This is a question in the chat too. How would you still get some bitterness in your final beer if you're just dry hopping on the, adding hops on like the cold side?
So this goes back to, and this is going to tie us directly into talking about the problems with the IBU scale, right? Because M. Floberg, I see the username there. That's a great question, right? Because there are breweries out there, and Six Point has done this before as well, talking about 0 IBU beers and beers that get no hops added to the hot side of the process, right? So when you're talking about adding bitterness, you want to add those hops earlier in the boil. You want them to have contact with that with higher temperatures, isomerize those alpha acids. That's what gives you the perceivable bitterness. Except there are lots of other ways to get perceivable bitterness that have nothing to do with isomerized alpha acids. And if you only add your hops at the whirlpool, which is the end of the boil, or the dry hopping, which is when you already have fermentation going on, you're still going to have some level of perceived bitterness, whether it's coming from the grains, right? Your malt, your barley husks will add a little bit of tannin that can add some perceived bitterness and astringency, which reads on most people's palates as adjacent to bitterness. You will get bitterness from the polyphenols and the vegetal matter in the hops, whether it be pellets or whole cones. And definitely if you're talking about fresh hop or wet hopped beers, where there's a ton more of the or more of the vegetal matter, and that vegetative matter, you're going to get more polyphenol extraction. There's also beta acids, which we haven't talked about at all, and beta acids get more bitter as they age. So if you have a beer that's getting more bitter as it gets older, the alpha acids are probably decreasing and your beta acids are climbing, and that's giving you a higher perception of bitterness. So it doesn't really correlate. IBUs don't correlate one-to-one or almost at all with what perceivable bitterness looks like in a beer, right? It doesn't take into account the balance of the beer, what style of beer you're doing, sweetness that might be coming from other factors in your beer. So yeah, the short answer is even a 0 IBU beer, quote unquote, is going to have some bitterness still from your hops, but also from other ingredients as well.
Yep.
Sydney, I know you said you specialize and your love lies more in like brewing Vienna lagers, but have you brewed any 0 IBUs or anything like that? Or
I mean, yeah, I mean, we've done hazies and we've done, we have a hazy on tap all the time that we're just cycling through different, and I have a couple that I bring back all the time. And then I have some that I'm just like, this cool hop, let's try it and see what happens. And that 0 IBU is simply just adding all your hops cold side, right? That's technically 0 IBUs, right? Because you're not adding any isomerization, you're not adding any heat. And so anything that you have none, cold side or none hot side, and you're in either late whirlpool, so generally under 180 degrees, into dry hopping, then that's considered like 0 IBUs. You may get some translation, and that's why you go into IBUs. Like IBUs it's a tool for people that are making recipes and trying to maintain consistency. Again, it doesn't include anything else that you're tasting in there. The malt, the yeast, the oil, like even just like the oils themselves of the hops. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can change the bitterness or the non-bitterness or the add things here or there. So it really just, it's a whole package, and you can't look at like an IPA and just say like, oh, it's 100 IBUs, so it's going to taste like this. And I was like, you really can't. And that's why a lot of times you just need to try it and see what you think.
Absolutely. Yeah. The terms that I always like to talk in when it comes to bitterness, I use IBUs when I'm talking to brewers. We use it sort of in the back of house, but as soon as it gets time to talk to bar managers or customers or anyone who's actually drinking the beer, I like to switch over and talk about perceived bitterness, because it's much more important, right? Yeah. Is this an assertive bitterness or is it a mellow bitterness? Is it a moderate bitterness? Right? You can have a scale with vocabulary that sort of denotes the same idea or connotes the same idea without using tying numbers to it. I think people get tied to a number and they say, oh, I only like IPAs that are above 70 IBUs, or I only like IPAs that are below 30 IBUs. And I understand that because so many breweries have sort of thrown IBU numbers in our face for a long time, but it's a broken system. And I think I would encourage anyone to sort of step outside the box of what they think they know about IBUs and try some beers that fall outside their comfort zone, and you might surprise yourself.
I hate it. And because I have regular customers who, when they first started coming to the brewery, they were like, well, I don't like anything that has IBUs. And I was like, well, let's learn. Let's talk about this because there's a lot of things to unpack right there. But now, they're drinking our double IPAs all the time. And that may be because their taste buds change over time. But at the same time, it's really just educating them on like what they like and not what they think they like or they think they don't like. Because IBUs, it scares away people from trying something that they may enjoy. And you may hate it. And that's okay too. That's fine. Drink what you like to drink. But, every once in a while, like kind of sneaking out of your comfort zone, I think you can find some really cool things.
For sure. And we haven't even talked about the other problem with IBUs, and that is to say that there's no good way of arriving at whatever number you're going to put on the chalkboard, right? There are a couple of calculations and equations that you can use. If you read any good home brewing or professional brewing book, they'll show you 2 or 3 different equations that you could punch some numbers into in your recipe and come up with an IBU number. But those equations don't match each other. So you sort of have to pick a formula that you like.
Yep.
And then there's also lab tests that you can do. And if you do a lab test on your beer that's supposedly going to give you the IBUs, that number is not going to match the equation that you used with your recipe. And it's also, there's noise and interference and feedback errors with the lab tests. So none of them are perfect, I would say. So if you're at a brewery and all you see is an IBU number on the board, you have to wonder, did they use equation A or equation B, or is that a lab tested number? And there's no consistency between the three. So another reason, I see Jen in the chat saying IBUs don't really mean anything to the consumer, question mark. I would encourage consumers to move away from IBU numbers and ask your beer tender, what's the bitterness on this? Don't say what are the IBUs, just say, how bitter is this beer? Right? Is it really bitter? Is it not very bitter? Maybe you don't like very bitter things. That's fine. Ask for something that's on the lower end of the bitterness spectrum. And if you don't use the word IBUs, hopefully they won't use it first.
Is there like, besides perceived bitterness, is there any sort of other quantitative measure out there that's, reliable? I guess not, or else you'd be using
for bitterness, or for like,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know of one
that kind of gives you like a quantitative measure of, the alpha acid.
I know that I had read in the New Brewer a few years ago about how they were trying to create like the perceived bitterness value, but like even that is subjective. And so it's hard for you to really figure out any of those like hard numbers and hard flavors.
It's not like ABV.
Like, sure, I can give you the ABV because that's, this is the alcohol, this is what is contained. But when it comes to it, I mean, if you have a 75 IBU IPA and a 75 IBU Imperial Stout, it's going to taste very different. And you're not going to get that perceived bitterness that you would from the stout to the IPA. And then even if you have a 75 IBU IPA and a double IPA, that's the same, they're going to taste very different because of the other ingredients that are in that beer that create the whole thing. And so a lot of that is on the recipe side, right? When we're trying to figure that out, you pick one and you stick with it. And that's this is how I figure it out. And that way I can gain some consistency, and like, at least when I'm doing my math and trying to figure out how to use this hop, I can use both experience and my way of doing it and get some kind of consistency out of it. But we were talking about this earlier. I mean, the alpha acid numbers you get on the bag, right, they're an average of a sample that they grabbed from their farm. And so like, it's a good estimate and it's a good range, but even then you can get some wiggle room outside of those numbers.
Yeah, no, yeah. So IBUs, there's a couple of comments in the chat about this as well. Okay. A couple questions have come through. So Larry is asking, with hundreds of potential flavors coming out of each hop variety, how does a brewer bring forward the flavors they want out of the hops? So Larry has tried to brew an IPA with a woody resin flavor coming forward for a couple of years, but hasn't been successful. It's not as, forward as they would like. And they've also attempted biotransformation. So I don't know if you have any advice about that.
For that, I mean, making sure you're picking a hop that has the oils that give those flavors. So that pinene, the myrcene, those hops, those are more of that like old school West Coast style IPA oils. And then honestly, for a homebrewer and for something at my size, a lot of it's trial and error. And you really are trying to figure out here or there. And once you have been brewing for a while, or once you've been trying that, you can get it where you want it. That was one of those things when I first started. I had talked to my previous boss and I was like, I was getting so frustrated because I was on, batch 2 of one of my year-round beers. And I'm like, it's not where I want it to be. And he's like, dude, it took me 200 tries to get to where I wanted it to be. It doesn't mean it's a bad beer. It may just not be exactly what you want. And so doing those little turns and changing one thing at a time is really how you're going to get that beer that specifically tastes like something that's in your head.
Yeah, I agree with that. Going back to something that Sydney was talking about earlier, I think hop teas are a really good thing that I would try there. Make sure that you're using hops that as a raw ingredient have those flavors that you're looking for. you say woody resin in that question. I'm assuming you mean like a pine resin type of flavor, but woody can also mean cedary or sandalwood or, Palo Santo. Some of the noble hops have sort of a woody note, especially even maybe more than noble. Some of the English hops get described as woody. So maybe look at something like an EKG or a Fuggle.
Yeah, I love EKG hops. Oh, that's one of my favorite hops too.
Yeah, and you're going to get some other flavors of those. Maybe you're going to get a little orange marmalade notes or something like that. But you might be able to pick and play and plug in some, some Fuggle alongside some Centennial or some, old school American sea hops and really build up that piney, cedary sort of flavor altogether. But again, I think that the trial and error is going to be your best bet there. I would probably shy away from biotransformation if I was going specifically for piney and woody. In my experience, and Sydney can absolutely disagree with me, but in my experience, when I see biotransformation, I see it leading to more fruit forward, tropical, stone fruit sorts of notes and sort of pulling chemicals away from earthy, piney sorts of resinous notes.
I completely agree. And that's why you see a lot of those, triple dry hop, hazy, juicy, all the adjectives beers. Those are generally the ones that have that heavy biotransformation because it gives that really intense like fruitiness. So if you're looking for more like that intensity of like a fruitiness, but with that pininess, it really is going to be less on biotransformation and more on what you're doing hot side, the materials you're using, the ingredients, and the timing of when you're adding it. My general thing is like when I'm doing like traditional style like West Coast, you have your bittering, which is at that 60. I generally do a 20-minute addition that adds a nice good punch, like not quite heavy bitter, but it's on that more like woody earthy style. So we have a West Coast IPA that's a year round for us. And this is my hop schedule. And then I do a 5-minute and a 1-minute, and then we dry hop it as well. And that allows for different flavors coming out in different quantities, and the amounts you're adding at each time can change to get exactly what flavors you're looking at. And a lot of it, I'm sorry, I don't have a specific answer, but it's trial and error for most.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like a lot of this is trial and error. So you were just talking about dry hopping as well, Sydney. So Barbara was asking if you could discuss more about your dry hopping preferences. Do you do them do you add the hops during fermentation or after? How long do you leave them in?
It depends on what I'm brewing, right? So it depends on what I'm trying to get from the beer. So if I'm doing a traditional West Coast, I'm probably going to do a traditional style of dry hopping traditional American style of dry hopping where I'll drop it down to the beer to get some of the yeast out. So I don't have too much material in the beer while I'm dry hopping to 55 degrees. And then I'll let it sit for probably 24 hours before I pull the yeast, and then dry hop at 55 for 3 days. And then I'll crash down to, cold as cold beer temperatures, 33. And for, hazies, juicies, and things like that, those big new school IPAs, that's when you get some of that biotransformation. That's when you want to add hops during fermentation, because it changes the flavors you're getting from the hops, and it allows it to be a little bit more robust, a little bit more juicy, and then it adds that haze that you get in a lot of those new school style IPAs. But I've also dry hopped sours. I love a good dry hop sour. So it really just depends on what you're brewing and what you want the end product to be. And a lot of that again is trial and error, and then experience. And then, if you're a home brewer and you want to try something, there's a lot of really cool, really good resources or recipes that will kind of walk you through on when and how much. And it really depends on what you're trying to get.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and that's how I've always brewed too. I was out at Craft Brewers Conference out in Minneapolis this year, and I watched a talk that was about haze stability specifically, so obviously relating to New England styles more than West Coast styles. But it was run by Dr. Laura Bell, who runs Omega Yeast Labs, and she incredibly smart woman who was mostly talking about yeast, but they had done a lot of research that played into dry hopping as well and when to dry hop for the best haze stability. And they have found that I have no professional data to back this up yet, except that what I heard her say was that they have found you'll get the most haze stable beers if you wait until you're at terminal gravity to dry hop for the first time. And they also have data that shows that you can continue to get biotransformation even 7 days after you're at terminal gravity. So if I was a home brewer, I would probably run out and play with that new data. But it's not something that I have any, again, no professional knowledge to back that up yet.
Hey, it's new information for me. I'm going to try it.
Yeah, other than that's what Dr. Bell said, and I know she's incredibly smart, so I put some faith in that. I see Dave's question in the Q&A about hops from South America. Dave,
I was curious too. I don't know. I don't think so. But
this is another one that I'm going to lean on the smarts of people more than me.
Argentina, maybe?
Probably in terms of commercial hop farming now, yes. Okay. But Dave, if you scroll all the way back in that chat to that hop latitudes graphic that I showed, you see these really two wide bands, right? 35 to 55, that's where those sunlight photo periods work out best. You can't grow hops in most of South America. You can't grow hops in almost all of Africa. Southeast Asia, you can't grow hops. So from a naturally occurring standpoint, there are no hops in the Southern Hemisphere that are known to brewers or even to hop farmers. I was talking to Stan Hieronymus, who wrote the book on hops. I was talking to him last week out at HomebrewCon in Pittsburgh, and I asked that exact same question because he was talking about Australian hops, and I said, hey, are there any hops in Australia that are actually native to Australia? And his answer was no. All of the hops that we know and love from Australia, from New Zealand, are all crosses of and new breeds that we've genetically bred based on Northern Hemisphere hops. So it's not a new species. They're all Northern Hemisphere hops that we've just transplanted to probably Argentina, maybe in Chile, South Africa and Australia and New Zealand, but they wouldn't be specific species that are native to South America.
All right.
That's a great question, though.
Yeah, very good question. Yeah. So one from Larry, this is interesting, like as a chemical engineer, they're talking about flash points. So do you all track the flash points of the essential oils so you can add them at temperatures below their flash points? So yeah, flash points like the lowest temperature a substance will vaporize. So yeah, I mean, I don't know because you have like the hops and the essential oils are contained in the lupulin glands. And so I don't know how that would work, but it's an interesting question.
I don't. I would guarantee that that's on somebody's checklist in some QA lab at these big breweries. A lot of time, I have 2 employees in our production facility feeding 2 places. So a lot of these things that like I absolutely wish I could do and love to do, there's just some things that aren't what I would consider a necessity at our size. And that's when you have these give and takes and kind of like, well, okay, do I want to have, 17 beers on tap, or do I want to make sure I have the chemical compound breakdown of my beer? And the economics says I should probably brew some beer.
Absolutely. Larry, just a little info for you. We don't track that either. Even, I work with 3 good sized breweries and none of them are tracking the flash points of the individual essential oils in each beer. But to sort of a larger point that you raise, if you watch hops from harvest all the way through production, through pelletizing, through production, to the point where brewers get them, it is something to pay attention to. The first step of that farming practice after they get picked is the kilning, right? The drying them out. And they're really particular in the kilns about not letting the hops get too hot because they don't want to degrade those essential oils. And in the pelletizing facilities where they're turning the hops from whole cone hops into pelletized hops, the temperature of the pelletizing machines is really closely monitored. And some of them even like cool the metal with liquid nitrogen to keep those pelletizing dyes as cold as possible to prevent degrading your essential oils. There is some really good research out there. What I would Google if you actually want to learn more about this is survivable compounds. And there are some cool charts out there. So Scott Janisch wrote the new book on IPAs and hops. And he sort of charted out which hops have more survivable compounds than others. Idaho 7, I know, falls really high on the survivables list. So if you add Idaho 7s to the hot side of your process, you're still going to have a lot of those essential oils survive to your finished beer. That's where the term comes from. And so we do look at those charts and take that into account. You know, if a hop is really low on the survivables list, then we'll save that hop for cold side use or for dry hopping. If it's higher on the hot side, or sorry, higher on that survivables compounds list, then we might be more willing to use it in late in the boil or something like that, or early in the whirlpool even, where it's going to get some exposure to some hotter temperatures. But as a general rule for survivables and essential oils, even as low as like 130 degrees, you can start to degrade those stuff. So pelletizing dyes, they like to keep them like 125.
All right, awesome. Yeah, thank you, Max, for the insight with that, because I thought that was super interesting being a chemical engineer, because it's like, well, we could track these things and, you know, always want to like science everything, but a lot of this is still intuition and an art. But yeah, Dave has a question. What about lupulin versus whole hops?
Like lupulin powder or like whole cone? So like, okay, so there's different types of use. There's whole cone. So there's fresh hop, wet hop, whole cone that have been dried or kilned. And then you've got, you know, T90 hops, which is a measurement of like how much vegetable matter there's in there to the lupulin glands or oils. And then there's T49 or T45, which isn't the heavily commonly used hop pellet. It has less vegetable matter. And then there's like products that have been extracted. So there's CO2 extracted like hop oils or hop extracts. And then lupulin powder, which that's a newer one. I've used it a couple of times and it clumps like crazy. So I don't really like it because it's really hard to use and it sticks in the bottom of my fermenters and I have to sit there and like wiggle the valve for like an hour to try and unclog it. So just like how farmers need to have a crop that will grow, a lot of times I need a product that I can actually use effectively in the brewery.
Yeah, there are so many, and they sort of get lumped under this title of like advanced hop products now. And, you know, whether it be lupulin powder or cryo.
Oh, yeah, cryo hops, there's one.
Hopsigner has one called Salvo. Haas has Incognito. YCH has American Noble. Right? There's all of these advanced hop products, and you always have to ask the question, like, what makes this different from another one? And they'll have some sort of marketing answer for you, and then you have to go do your own trial and error and see what you like about it. Sometimes they're going to clump, like Sydney said. Some of them are liquid and pourable. Lupulin... Yeah, lupulin would be a part of all of those, just in different phases and in different stages. So it sort of comes down to brewer preference, and whole cone brings with it again all sorts of logistical challenges and maybe some upside to it, depending on which brewer you ask, but also decreases in yield and increases in handling challenges. So whole cone hops would contain lupulin, but not as much lupulin as a pure lupulin powder would.
I was like, I don't know if we actually told them what lupulin is. So lupulin is a lupulin gland. So I like to describe it kind of like a little boba ball in the corner of the flower that's just containing all the good stuff. And sure, you get some flavors and stuff from the vegetal matter and stuff, but the lupulin gland has all it's the liquid gold that the brewers really want. And that is in the cone of the hop flower. Just to throw that out there, because I don't think we said that at all.
No, we haven't. That's a great point. Right? Little yellow, golden, waxy globules that contain those alpha acids and the essential oils.
Yes.
So,
go ahead.
I was just going to say the goal of these advanced hop products from a lot of suppliers is to get as high of a percentage of alpha acids and or essential oils into the finished product with as low of a percentage as possible of the vegetative matter. And then ideally make it a form that brewers can use, make it pourable, make it dissolvable.
And even some of those like the hop products, like I'm not a big fan of the extractions. I think they add this kind of I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of like a slick bitter that I'm really not a fan of. And I generally, if I taste it, I'm like, this has probably had, that the CO2 extracted liquid hop extract that I'm just not a fan of. So a lot of times that can come down to the brewer and their preference and what they're doing in the process and what flavor they want at the end and how much. So like sometimes if you're brewing 120 barrels of something, like again, a lot of times it's I wish it could just be at 100%, quality, must go all beer, perfect all the time. But sometimes that economic portion and like what it looks like on cost wise and what you can do at the end. So there are some places that have made that trade-off. And a lot of times people can't tell except for people that have been trained. And so it doesn't necessarily matter in mass, but it's my preference to not use some of those products. I've tried cryo and that has a pretty good, that clumps too, but it's not as clumpy.
Yeah. So a question about, from Dave, using steam hops. And yeah, I don't know what steam hops
I don't know what steam hops are.
I already asked Dave in the chat
to
clarify that
I was
term.
just like, it's probably something I just don't know about. But
No,
like
I've
mash hops? Or
I've never heard the term steam hops before, so I don't know.
New one.
Hopefully Dave will get back to us quick with some clarification.
So yeah, last call. So if you have any final questions, please drop those in the Q&A. Oh, Josh is posting it now. But
I know there's so many things we could talk about with hops, and we could clearly talk for another 3 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, do you all want to talk maybe about gruits real quick? So, Max mentioned this earlier. So the idea of using, very, very little amounts of hops, because
if you're a commercial brewery, and you're doing a gruit, you have to add hops because the government doesn't like beers that don't have hops because they want their money. But a gruit is a beer with no hops, technically. And then generally you're getting that preservative factor and the flavors and all that kind of stuff from other things. So you have to add, spruce tips we talked about, or there's like roots. I'm not coming up with some in my head right now, but there's like herbs you can add that will add some of that preservative factor that hops do give, which we didn't talk about either, which hops help preserve the quality of the beer and the potability of the beer, I guess, and because they're antimicrobial. But gruits, they're a weird little, that's where beer was before hops became the thing. So you find beer all over the world, but whether it's beer with hops or if it's a gruit, that's a different thing.
Right. And we're only talking about this because when our pre-event chat started, I just thought it was funny. I sat down at my desk and the book that was right next to me is Against All Hops, which is a book specifically about gruits. And I thought that was a little bit ironic given tonight's topic. But yeah, gruit is what beer was before hops came into being, in the 8th century and, by the 1400s. And they were really widespread in the 1500s. Basically, almost all beers were containing hops. But right, it was things like bog myrtle and yarrow and sweet kale, and all of these other aniseed, and other spices and stuff that you don't really think about in modern life, because hops are a better solution in almost all cases, or at least an easier solution. Right, in the 1400s, that antimicrobial property of hops was really important because they didn't understand germ theory yet. But in 2022, the antimicrobial hops quality of hops is less important, right? Because brewers focus on sterilization and cleanliness, and they clean their vessels, and we know to use soap and water to remove germs. So antimicrobial is less important now than it was then, but that was really important 700 years ago. So I'll let you talk while I read Dave's response.
I was like, I just read that and I was like, wait, what? I've never heard of that steam hops. Must be either a very new.
Okay. So
wait, the isomerization could go right. Couldn't it reverse too? I don't know.
So yeah, there's two things going on here, Dave. I've never heard the term steam hops before, but you can buy the CO2 extract is one of the things that Sydney was talking about there, and that's an extraction of your alpha acids, and you get a syrup. I mean, it is a really sticky. I've seen it when I've toured the hop pellitizing facilities. Some of them do
get it on you.
extraction too. Right? Yeah. I mean, you dip your finger in it, and it's like glue. And also the most extremely bitter thing you've ever tasted. They say not to taste it. That's a good way for me to taste it. But so CO2 extract is not pre-isomerized, but then you can buy pre-isomerized extracts as well. I've never seen pre-isomerized hops where they're actually selling you like hop cones or hop pellets that would have already been isomerized and sold in increments of bitterness. But definitely for extracts, you can buy pre-isomerized extracts. I'll have to do a little bit more research, and maybe Beer Maker is doing something new that I haven't read about. I don't even know if it's like commercially available to brewers. Sometimes home brewers get fun new stuff before big brewers do, for feedback purposes. But I'll have to look into that, Dave. But yeah, pre-isomerized acids, that's a really nice way for brewers to sort of tweak and tune a recipe if they need to. If it's someone who's a really big scale, especially, right? Someone like Budweiser. You don't think of Budweiser as having bitterness, but there's a specific level of IBUs that they look for in Budweiser. And if they have a giant batch that gets to the end of the process and they realize it's one IBU too low, that's a big deal for Anheuser-Busch. So then they would look to a product like a pre-isomerized extract that you could add right before packaging to tweak that bitterness to where they want it to be. I think that's something that I would expect you would see a lot less of on the craft side, or especially on really small scale stuff. But it does exist, and it does exist for that reason specifically, sort of to allow for fine tuning later.
Yeah. I would say most craft brewing. I mean, to do those kind of products and that kind of like extreme fine tuning, you're going to be, I would say, minimum. I don't know. This is me just ballparking. I would say minimum, 60,000 barrels. I mean, of a single beer, right? You're trying to get a fine tune of something that in the craft beer world, it's just like, well, it's a little different.
Because all like scale is so important and relevant to this conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, with that, like we only have a couple more minutes left. I know, like we had talked earlier, and a lot of people have probably seen this as well, is some of the marketing with respect to hops and IPAs, especially, like I feel like Sydney was talking about the Hallmark movie. There's lots of memes about like Citra and Mosaic hops, you see those, and, how does that play into, what you're brewing and things like that? And, how do you feel with the marketing of these specific hops and how those are perceived by the general public?
For when I'm doing a beer, I generally try and have, so like our key factor in designing a new beer or in a new menu design, because I take great pride in making sure that my menu has heavy variety. So we've got the light, the dark, the hoppy, the different types of hoppy. So you've got the West Coast bitter, the higher ABV fruities, and you're trying in stouts and doing all of that. But when you're doing IPAs and you want something, if you're in a bind and you're like, I just need something that I know is going to sell well, you're going to go with the heavy hitters, and you're going to go with the ones that you know are going to be good. And a lot of times is that Cicerone Mosaic combination, because it's a great flavor combination.
Yeah,
it's an easy one to do. And if you want to add a little bit of, something to it to change it up, you add, another hop in there to kind of just give it a little something different. But if you're trying to find, like, if you go to a IPA heavy place, you'll generally see a lot of those new school type of hops. So Galaxy, Idaho 7, you'll get the Cicerone Mosaic. You won't find as many IPAs with Chinook, and some of those, like, I had a hop head come in, they're like, well, you don't have any of the what did he say? It was like, not high-end hops, but like VIP hops or something like that. And I was like,
what does that even mean?
What? Because
whole subculture surrounding this, I feel like.
You can have a beer that's like good and have just the label of Galaxy or Nelson Sauvignon or one of those hops on there, and it'll sell like crazy, and people will be like, this is amazing, it's the best beer in the world. And I'm like, it's a good beer. Like, I agree, it's a good beer, but then you can have an equally delicious or even more delicious beer with those, the C's, the 5C beers that is phenomenal, but it won't quite sell as fast or as a lot of times in a small place like us, where you get people that are into that craft and sometimes collect them all mentality, where you're trying all these things and trying to find the newest and freshest thing. And so marketing does come into it sometimes. And when I've had an IPA where it's like experimental 5, 2, 3, 4, and that's the name, and people are like, well, what is it? And I was like, I can't tell you.
Yeah, and just for 1 minute, Josh, I see you just joined the conversation, so I'll make this quick. But those experimentals where you're only getting a number from the brewers, from the farmers, that's a really good indication that you're looking at a hop that hasn't been in the ground for 15 years yet, right? We talked about that timeline from bringing a hop from first cross to commercial viability. Once they get to the point where they're looking for brewer feedback, then they'll start reaching out to brewers and saying, hey, we have this new hop that we think is pretty cool, HBC 586, right? Do you want to give it a go, brew up a batch of it, and let us know what you think? Let us know how it tastes in the recipe. What kind of flavor notes are you getting from it? And is this a hop that you would pay premium price for or full price for? Because usually when you're getting those numbered hops, you're getting them either at a substantial discount or sometimes even for free from hop farmers and growers that just want feedback and they trust you as a brewer. Sometimes once they get closer and they know, oh, this hop is about to get a name because we really like it, then they sort of spin the tables and they say, now you're going to pay for it because it's already exclusive and there's just no acreage of it. So that can go back and forth a little bit. But as a consumer, don't be surprised if there aren't any tasting notes for hops that only have numbers, because they haven't even gotten to the point where the farmers have named them yet.
All right, well, I'll jump in here. I just want to extend our thanks to this incredible panel. I think that there has been a ton of information here, and I don't even know how 90 minutes or 91 minutes at this point has gone by, because I've now spent about 3 hours with this group talking about nothing but hops, if not longer. And I still am learning stuff every single day as you guys were talking about it. And Sydney, you said the same thing. You're learning new stuff every day, and Jenna as well. And I mean, to be in the presence of a potential master Cicerone as well is always something that we don't take for granted. As you might have heard Max allude to this, and Sydney as well, that Max is waiting for results on a Master Cicerone exam. So to even have taken that exam, I think is a piece of notoriety that just needs to be known, Max. So we're all proud of you from the UConn community. Max was telling us prior to this, there are only 20 in the world. So if Max does get that call, we are in the presence of greatness here. So Max, all our best from UConn Nation here. We'll be thrilled to hear, and we're so proud of you regardless of what the results are, but we all know what's going to happen. So we're all good. We'll talk to you next time. We'll bring you in, and we'll have the aura behind you for when that comes next. That being said, a huge thanks to Dr. Jen, Pascal, and Sydney and Max for all their insight today. As you can tell, they're definitely experts. They know what they're talking about. And there's still things that they're learning along the way. I mean, obviously, there's tons to be known in this beer world. And if you saw it, I'll drop it in the follow-up email that we have as well. If you want to learn more about how close cannabis and hops really are, we've done a small session on this already, talking about cannabis in the beer industry. We did that about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. I did drop that link into the chat. If you didn't grab it, I'll make sure it goes out as a follow-up as well in our follow-up email communication to you all. But the other thing I'm going to drop in now is, as you all know, we do continue all of these 1881 events. The next one in the queue right now is actually our On the Rocks section, where we're going to be diving into all things rye whiskey. So if you're interested in that, Thursday, July 28th, same time, same bat place, 6 o'clock. You can find us right here. I'll be jumping into a conversation with Irene Tan of Whiskey Mentors, based right here in the northeast corner of Connecticut. A fellow UConn alum who's going to talk to us about that. So definitely just drop that into the chat there. Grab that before you take off today as well. And we'll also get that into the follow-up communication. But again, huge thanks to you all for your time, for your expertise, and just for being a fun group. I mean, as you can tell, it was definitely a good dialogue through everything tonight, and we're really appreciative of that. So, and for all of you joining us tonight, thank you again for taking some time to spend with us. We'll get the recording out to you so you can share with all your family and friends and tell them how much fun you had. But we look forward to seeing you at the next time we do this. And until then, enjoy, have a great beer, and we'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone.